Morning, good afternoon, wherever you're joining from. My name is Jodine Baker, and I am the Vice President, Research, Advocacy, and External Relations at Imagine Canada. It is my pleasure to extend a very warm welcome to everyone here. We're happy to have you all join us for this virtual workshop on equity as a practice from audits to action. I'd like to thank Scotiabank very much for their support of this project, this initiative. We would not have been able to do this work without their support. Before we get into our conversation today, I would like to begin by taking a moment to acknowledge the physical lands that we're joining in from today, even though we are having a virtual event. Imagine Canada's staff, operations, work, and network depend on traditional Indigenous territories to provide us physical space, sustenance, safety, and community to work, live, and play. Our physical head office is located on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinabeg, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wyandot. We acknowledge that these lands are covered by Treaty 13 and the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. We acknowledge that these lands are still home to many diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. Personally, I'm joining you today from Winnipeg, which is located in Treaty 1 territory, the home and traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Innu, and Dakota peoples, and in the national homeland of the Red River Métis. We acknowledge that our ability to live and work on these lands today is a direct benefit of policies of expulsion and assimilation of Indigenous peoples during the time of settlement and confederation and since. The harms of these policies are many and are still being felt in Indigenous communities today. We express gratitude towards the Indigenous peoples who have and will continue to steward these lands. We commit to amplifying the voices of Indigenous peoples and working against the everyday forces of white supremacy and colonialism present in the nonprofit sector. As we are all joining in remotely today, I would like to invite everyone to take a short moment to reflect on the lands on which each of us are situated, the land that each of us is living on, working on, that's allowing us to join in as this virtual community today. Please feel free to share where you're joining from in our chat. For today's workshop, a few housekeeping notes. We invite you to participate using the Zoom tools at the bottom of your screen. You can use the chat function for any questions or raise your hand. You can find the raise hand button. It's a little hard to find in Zoom. It's in the react button at the bottom. So if you click on react, you will see an option to raise hand pop up. Our session is being recorded today. A link to the recording will be shared in the coming days. If you do have any technical questions at any point during the workshop, please do let us know in the chat. I would also like to thank our advisory council. So we do have a slide here with their names and organizations. Their time and contributions towards this project are greatly appreciated and absolutely help to strengthen the work that we were able to produce. I would now like to turn things over to two members of the Saltwater consulting team who led the development of the From Audits to Action guide and will be leading our workshop today. They are Emily Yee Clare and Phyllis Lettner.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to actually stop sharing screen so I can see all of those whose faces are available. I'll see those. Kelsey, do you want to maybe take a start while I figure out the Zoom?
For sure. Hi and welcome everyone. Thanks for having us today. We're so excited to share with you a little bit of what we put together in this resource guide. My name is Thalasi. My pronouns are she and her. I am of Sri Lankan Tamil descent, but I was born here in Edmonton in Amaskwitchi-Waskagan, Beaver Hills House, known in the Cree language. This is Treaty 6 territory and the traditional territories and gathering place of many Indigenous communities and nations, including those of the Cree, Métis, Dene, Blackfoot, Nakota Sioux, and Saulteaux, and many others. I just wanted to say, as part of my land acknowledgement and building that of the one that Jodine shared, before we even jump into this work, we know today that we're going to talk about equity. And one major consideration to have before you start your work on equity, or even if you're in the midst of it, is that the language and frameworks of equity, diversity, and inclusion do not always account for, and sometimes never account for, the experiences and rights of Indigenous peoples and communities. So as you embark on your work, we really encourage you to turn towards your relationships. For those of us that are in non-Indigenous organizations, turn towards our relationships relationships with the Indigenous peoples and communities that we work with and on the lands that we're on, and ask them, following appropriate protocols, how they would like you to address their needs, concerns, their relevant address their needs, concerns, priorities, and goals in a way that respects their rights and their rights to self-determination and sovereignty. So I just wanted to name that first because a land acknowledgement is not just an appropriate thing to do, but something that contextualizes our work. And I think Jodine's land acknowledgement really named that the context is colonialism and it has ongoing impacts that we want to make sure our processes acknowledge in a good way. So that's where I just wanted to mention that before we even go any further. Emily?
Beautiful. Thank you for doing that brief intro. I'm also in Edmonton, Alberta. But I'm currently based in Montreal, otherwise known as Tiohtià:ke or Muniang. For this project, we've been working with Saltwater Consulting. We're just like a small consulting firm in Montreal that really loves to kind of nerd out about equity, change management, all of these complex ideas. And one of the ways we actually bonded was when we were working. Tulsi was actually our client, and we were talking, and then we started nerding about like, are equity audits really the solution? Are there ways of like doing things in a different way, in a more process oriented sort of way? So this is kind of a product of like many years and back and forths. So very excited to present today. Shall we dive in?
Let's do it.
Okay, great. I'll just start sharing slides again.
Yeah. Oh, there you go.
Beautiful. All right. So some of you may have seen that this is our tool. So I'm just going to put the link into the chat. I can't see many faces, but have any of you actually seen, like, taken a quick look at the document? You can do thumbs up. Not yet. Okay, great. So this will be a bit of an
Okay.
intro. Yeah.
Awesome. We were invited by Imagine Canada to put together a resource that would be a practical help to small to medium organizations, nonprofits, and charities who want to do something around equity, primarily an equity audit or an assessment or check-in, something that would allow you to embark on this work. And Emily and I, like she said, have been nerding out about this for a really long time and wanted to put something together that really reflected our experience doing
Yep.
this work. I've been working in the field of anti-racism and equity as it relates to organizational change and development for about 10 years now.
Yep.
And I know when I started, I really wished maybe there was a template or a roadmap that I could use that would help guide the work. And even if there were, and there are some out there, you can find them online, and I don't want to diminish them in any way. What we wanted to do is create a resource that would help you navigate some of the questions that will inevitably come up in your process. And so, in our introduction to the guide, we talk about what the word audit means to us, and we're going to go over that together today. We offer 5 guiding steps, actually 5 guiding questions that will anchor your process and some guidance on how we stay in this work when it gets difficult. And certainly it is very difficult right now. And I don't want to hide the fact or ignore the fact that we're working in difficult times in terms of equity, diversity, inclusion, and anti-racism work. And so that last section is important now more than ever. And we really wanted to offer that so that we can take care of ourselves, take care of each other, and
Yeah.
stay well in this work as we do it, as we do it.
Beautiful. So what we thought we're kind of had a bit of back and forth, like, do we go through each of the steps? And then we were like, wait a minute, let's just kind of present 3 of the core main concepts of the resource. So the first thing we're going to explore are mindsets. So, like, how do we shift from an audit mindset to more of a practice mindset? And really, hopefully, we're going to create a space in 1 hour where you will be able to reflect on your work on equity and what might be some of the kind of mindsets that we might be bringing to it, and some of the dominant mindsets that are within our like society and culture, and what are the ways that we can push against and actually shift to a new way of kind of relating to equity work in a I personally experience it in a much more sustaining and productive and transformative manner. The second thing that we're going to be doing is this concept of circularity. So this is where we will be going through the 5 guiding steps at a very high level. There's obviously a lot more detail in the actual tool, but you'll get a good overview of the kind of approach that we're talking about. And then finally, we'll be going into this idea of paradox. So like, how do we stay in the work? How do we balance the kind of seemingly opposed kind of ideas that are often present within this work in the end? All right. So to kick it off, we're gonna invite folks to come and do this Mentimeter. Let me know if there's any tech issues. Are people able to access it? There's a QR code. I put the link in the chat as well. Great. There should be 2 questions. Yeah, so we're gonna wait for folks to finish the first question. So we have about 36 participants, so I'll change it in shortly. Beautiful. We have about 45 participants. All right. Give you 5 more seconds. Beautiful. All right. And you may not have done it, and I apologize, but we're going to move to the second slide. Has it shifted for people? To the next slide, just to double check. Nope. Okay. Okay. Has it? Yep. Okay, great.
There we go.
Beautiful. Thank you. Beautiful. And we'll, of course, look at the word clouds after. Well, this is beautiful. Thank you all for doing this. It's really neat to see
Can't wait
the
to see them.
responses. Yeah.
They still coming in.
Yeah, they're still coming in.
We wanted to get your insights first because we feel like the word audit has so many different connotations associated with it, so many assumptions that are freighted with it, that might actually get in the way of us doing good equity work. So we wanted to surface some of those things and see how we can shift them for ourselves as we move into equity as a practice. Emily, what do we got
Yeah, let's
for these word
just
clouds?
let's see. Let's try and move it over. Can people see my screen with the word
Yep,
clouds? Great. Start presentation.
there we go.
So, yeah, what are you seeing?
It's a little small. Can you zoom in a bit?
Ooh, how do I zoom in? I should have. Nope, that's not gonna help.
No.
Um, why don't we read out things and then you'll be able to get a nice screen cap of all the things. But there's words like financing, policing, evaluation, compliance, review, evidence, transparency, investigation. And then some of the smaller words are colonial, vigilance, documentation, helpful for a specific time, record, right or wrong. Yeah. Anything else sticking out for you?
No, those are great. This is great. Thank you for sharing, everyone.
And this is the second one for practice. So we hear doing, getting better, action, learning, effort, repetition, process, improvement, implementation, intention. And then some of the smaller ones are less threatening, leading by example, skill building, continuous improvement, ways of being. Beautiful.
Great. Well, what we wanted to do with this exercise was to just have a moment for ourselves to see what we might be bringing into our work when we start thinking about equity in terms of audits on their own. Like I said, when I started this work, I think it would have been nice to have a template or something, a checklist maybe that was sort of standardized, maybe compliance oriented, something that was comprehensive that I could just, fill out, find out where all the gaps are, and then just execute and be done. And all of that builds a mindset that's quite linear with fixed endpoint and a fixed beginning point. And we realized that in our own work, as soon as we embarked on it, almost immediately became clear that that wouldn't be possible. That you might even get as far as doing the checklist, but as soon as you want to move into action, a different process emerges. So what we wanted to do was encourage all of us to just take a moment and see what mindsets we might be bringing into our work on equity in general and see how we might be able to shift into something that's moving from that linear idea of like moving through a very linear process from step to step into something that's more circular, something that is check boxes or a checklist or sort of that sort of standard list into something that's more adaptive and purpose built for your organization. Rather than looking for an objective look on what equity might be inequities might be emerging inside your organization, maybe moving towards something that's relational and subjective. Um, Instead of looking for a universal answer, some sort of universal solution that might fit everyone's needs, really finding the ways in which you need to work contextually. And I already mentioned that before in terms of understanding the context for Indigenous folks. Audits also kind of make an assumption that we know that we'll be able to find what is true out there. And what we've learned is that it's more emergent. Things will reveal themselves to you over time, slowly as you do your work. An audit makes it seem like it's a very discrete piece of work that's standalone. Again, in our work, we found that it's developmental. It's something that builds over time and it was central in that second word cloud, learning. Learning was like the biggest word in that practice word
Hmm.
cloud. And that's a big piece around how audits are really different from like the practice that we're actually trying to embed in our organizations. And again, like I said, audits make it feel like there's an end point. And as we get to the end of this webinar, we will talk about the paradoxes that you're going to live with in a continual manner as you do this work. Emily, what else would you add to this?
I think that was a really kind of good overview. And so maybe the invitation is for you all to take a couple moments to just kind of reflect on this question of how might a shift towards practice change the way that your organization or you yourself approach equity. So I'm going to put the question in the chat. And if someone wants to, well, considering the constraints, we might be only able to hear from a few people, but feel free to like raise your hand and we'd love to hear from you, or you can put something in the chat and we'll be sure to capture all of these insights as well.
And one thing I want to say, just so I don't lose it, an audit is a useful tool. It is like something that you can embed in your practice, but it isn't the end all be all. And often,
Yep.
sometimes an over focus on an audit will take away from, detract from the important work that we need to do overall in our practice, as we're going to explain. So, yeah, I don't want to take away from the practice itself of doing it, but wanting to just want to complicate it a little bit.
Yeah, and I feel that in my experience, I'm I get kind of stressed out when I feel like I have to be objective and or I have to take on this expert stance. And so I find that when I have a more of a practice kind of mindset, I can kind of let go of my perfectionism and kind of be a lot more curious and open to what's present within the system that I'm working within. So we're getting some really great things in the chat.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll read out a few things.
Yeah.
So Sharon wrote, increase the focus on learning as a journey. Cups HR wrote, ideally embed equity as something we include in all of our roles instead of a project strategy to complete. It's a marathon, not a sprint. Embed in practice when leadership changes, sets the bar high and shows the commitment to the work. Yeah. iPhone says, in a way, the audit also encourages organizations to start the work, but practice is a continuous process. Yeah, that's actually a really great thing that sometimes you might want to figure out what is your baseline, where are you starting from, and maybe looking at the data, and we actually go into some of the data collection stuff within the document. That can be a really great place of like, oh, maybe these could be places that we can, there's levers for change here in different ways. Yeah. Um, Threads equity throughout a work more deeply than a one-off survey. Yeah,
Yeah. Yep.
yeah. And Sonia wrote, audits are easier to follow if the organization's or leadership's understanding of DEI is low.
Mhm.
Practice is possible once the foundation is built. And I
Sure.
would also argue, or not argue, but kind of invite this kind of reflection that like it also doesn't always have to be at the complete organizational level, that we can almost work at a fractal level, that if you yourself can embody this more practice perspective, then it can create a degree of role modeling for the rest of the organization, including leadership, depending on your position within the organization. Yeah.
Yeah, it can build a bit of a muscle and build some demonstrable, like some, it can demonstrate the work in a way that will build buy-in over time. Starting small is not the worst, not the worst way to do this work. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you all for sharing those reflections and shifting with us. I think we've got a good couple quotes here that help maybe land it in terms of what this work really requires us to do. We'll let you take a moment to read those. Emily, how have these impacted you
These
in your
quotes.
work? Yeah.
Well, I love Grace Lee Boggs. It's as someone who's of Chinese descent, it's like very important to have like radical revolutionary elders. And so I love a Grace Lee Boggs quote. But I think this idea of transforming yourself to transform the world, I think it shows how the equity work is really within yourself in many ways, and how do you anchor within it, and how are you in relation to other people, because it's like I am who I am because of the communities and the spaces I'm within. And so if I have a kind of good sense of that flow, I find that it can be nourishing and healing, because this work can be so exhausting and
Mhm.
painful and violent at some in some cases,
Yeah.
but if there are ways that you can resource yourself throughout it, it can be quite beautiful. And I think what Adrienne Marie Brown is like, as a first place, we can practice justice, liberation, and alignment with each other and the planet. Yeah. How
Yeah,
about you?
and I love these. I love these because for me, you don't have to be an expert to be able to do this work. You don't need to hire a consultant to do this work. You can start with wherever you are, and if you're committed to a learning process, a circular process that we're going to take you through next, you can build this muscle very quickly. And I think that's really a really generous way of thinking about equity, building equity in our organizations.
Yeah. And I see a question in the chat
Hmm.
from Liz. If you were starting from one part of the organization to show demonstrable result, where might you start? Policy development? We're going to get into this right at our when we go into the circularity of it all, and hopefully,
Yeah. Maybe we can provide some examples there, but thank
yeah.
you for that question. Awesome. So here it is. Here's a visual of what we mean by shifting from a linear process to a circular process. This is our best way of sort of like nested circles, and I'm going to take you through them. Um, they're anchored by these five questions on the left. Why equity? Equity for who? These two questions happen in a state of reflection. They require some stillness, a sense of pause, maybe not rushing into these questions.
Yep.
But taking some time before moving into the active mode. The active mode, and we'll get into the details of these, is where you spend most of your time. It's the heart of the process where you go through iteratively asking the questions, what, so what, now what, and responding to what you find, taking informed action and learning as you go. The what, so what, now what, some of you may recognize from Liberating Structures is just a helpful way of sort of guiding your work and being that sort of learning organization. The whole thing is held together by an inner drive or a muscle that allows us to stay in this work when it gets difficult. It will get difficult. It's difficult to even start. So these are great practices to hold while we do the work. So the metaphor that came to mind as we were putting this together is that it's sort of like the active mode for me is like being in a fast moving river. The river is flowing and it is slowly but surely changing its environment as it goes, and it is changing itself as it goes. A river is always changing, and that is what we want our equity work to be doing, constantly responding to the environment and changing things as we go. But from time to time, a river will slow down and enter a wetland. And in that wetland, all the debris and all the silt that was collected along the way that kind of muddy the waters are allowed to settle and the water is clarified. And so too in reflection mode, which you can return to from time to time, will allow you to clarify and strengthen your intentions and your goals and your purpose around equity. And the whole time, the inner driver, the muscle of it for me is the quality of water. I love it. Emily always says that. She's always like, be like water. And it is like, how can we be like water? How can we kind of shift our way of being and shift those mindsets so that we can stay in this work in the long term? Because that's what we really need to do. It takes a long time for this work to happen. And we want to make sure that we're able to sustain ourselves as we do it. So I'm going to spend a couple seconds talking about the first two questions, and then I'm going to hand it over to Emily. So why equity? I've been working in this field for a while now, and I've kind of been astonished at finding how organizations either spend like little to no time answering the question why equity is important to their organization, or way too much time. So, for example, like there was one organization I was working with, and they were all so clear that they were all very committed to equity. But then it was also immediately clear that they all had very different definitions of it, very different reasons why it was important to their organization, very different kind of conceptions of how it would be made manifest in their organization. And it led to conflict, tension, confusion, and actually the project got shut down. And so that's an example of when we aren't clear about why equity is important to our organization, it can lead to a perceived failure of equity and an abandoning of the effort entirely. And so what I encourage organizations to do is to sit with this question, and they don't have to sit with it for very long, but make sure you understand why equity is important to your organization, where you are situated, to your communities that you work within. Link it to your vision, mission, and values. Link it to your theory of change and your strat plans, because that is what's going to keep it anchored for you. And you're going to be able to return to this over and over again. It should be something that allows every person in your organization from top to bottom, from the board to a volunteer to
Yep.
a member of your community, that will be able to look at this and be like, oh, right, this is why it's important to us. This is not just some sort of add-on. It's something that that's really just part of our organization. Again, on the other end of the spectrum, seeing a board sit, I saw a board once sit for a whole year to write what they wanted was an evergreen equity statement. And it took a year for them to do this, to write a statement that they put on their website. They basically spent a year in reflection mode, didn't take any action, but because it took so much time and resources, it felt like they took action, and they were like, we're done. Like, our work on equity is done. We've stated our commitment. And so we want to find like that right size in the middle. What's a good enough definition for you to start with, for you to take action? That is because you're going to return back and over time refine and strengthen that why. But it doesn't need to be perfect to begin with. Similarly, we're answering equity for who. I've noticed organizations have a little bit of all or nothing thinking about this question. We need to build a strategy or an audit that addresses everyone's concerns at the same time, or we're not going to do it at all. And we run the risk when we do this of playing what I might call oppression Olympics or equity pie politics, where we're pitting groups against each other over scarce resources and time and attention. And that's the last thing that we want to be able to do. What we want to do is be able to start. Every organization knows that there are certain communities that have concerns or have experienced harm or have actually like told you about the barriers that they face, you might have some inkling, a place where you know your relationships need to
Yeah.
be tended to. Start there. And if you don't have that information right at your fingertips, you might be able to find it fairly easily. And we offer some guidance in our toolkit on how to do this. Um, and just trust that if you start somewhere with some group of concern, the circular process will help you build that circle of concern over time. And it will help you broaden the people that are impacted by your efforts on equity. Also, the sister concept to equity, intersectionality, understands that all of our concerns are linked. And so, ideally, your work on equity should strengthen and make things better for everyone. In fact, that should be an indicator of you doing good work on equity, is that everyone's lives are getting better. Your organization is better, like equipped to achieve its own goals because of the work it's doing for everyone. And so, the circularity and the intersectionality of it helps you not have to put too much weight on this one question, equity for who. You can start with where you're at, with who you're with, before you go into active mode. Emily, what's that like?
Beautiful. So just to highlight a comment slash question in the chat, which is kind of in line with what Liz said. Diana said, I hope I'm pronouncing your name all right. If we frame practice as continuous learning, how do we ensure accountability and tangible results? While audits follow a linear process that pushes organizations to act and demonstrate progress, continuous learning can risk becoming an ongoing cycle without clear outcomes. So how do we prevent that? And I guess the kind of foil to circularity is maybe something like cycling, where you just feel like, oh, I'm just bouncing back and forth and not making progress. So this next phase. This is where we talk about the active mode. And this is where you start identifying the concrete what you will be ultimately be doing. So often there is kind of a moment where there is some sort of data collection where you figure out everything that you might want to do, or you could just take a small kind of sliver and kind of focus on like, how is our event planning going? What are our working conditions kind of looking at? So you can just pick something small and you almost can have that as in a kind of a sandbox to experiment and kind of dig deeper in particular ways. So often when you start kind of focusing, you start getting all your data, you're figuring out, okay, what is present within the organization? How are people feeling? You really want to shift to the so what. And this is where you start developing clear orientations of where you want to start working. The so what is where, depending on what's the capacity of your organization, you make sense of what you are seeing and start figuring out what is the next step, the now what you want to do. What I'm going to do now is share a quick case study of the a so what sort of situation. So recently I was working with a group. They wanted to do an EDI process. And so we did a diagnostic where we kind of surfaced all the dynamics with the organization. And in what we heard within the organization, there was a sense of there was some really kind of intense things that have been happening organizationally. And at that point, there was a desire like, we don't want to offer any solutions or any ideas. We're exhausted from these kind of questions. We want you to come up with the answers. And even though I know that it's best to kind of make things as participatory and kind of coming from the system as much as possible, we were like, okay, we'll come up with a clear action plan. When we presented what we heard in the diagnostic back, people were like, wow, I finally feel really heard. This is really powerful. And when we presented the action plan, there was a very strong, what are you doing? Like, you aren't listening to us, you aren't consulting with us. And it was a really beautiful moment where people shared that because they had felt so seen and heard in the kind of sense making around what had surfaced about organizational dynamics, that they were able to step into a posture where they were willing to kind of contribute solutions for the organization. So it can be very easy to kind of like go back into that dynamic of like, okay, I'll give you all the answers. But often you'll find something that's a lot more sustained and a lot deeper and transformative if you go into kind of an orientation where you allow the system to tell you what it needs. And so often what can happen then is that as you surface and kind of make sense of what has come out, you will have very clear action items that will come out, whether or not it's like, let's focus on this policy, let's kind of look at our hiring practices, we need some trainings organizationally. So it doesn't have to be that big, but it can be a place where you can deepen your understanding of what is actually adapted and attuned to what the organization needs. Another example I'll give was I used to work at the Center for Community Organizations. One of the ways that I experimented with this was that we wanted to develop some sort of care policy. Um, and so that became kind of the little kind of focus point that we wanted to work on. And so what we did, we talked to all the members of the team, we talked to the board, and we're like, what is the sort of work environment that we want to have at Coco? And I can throw the link to the policy in the chat afterwards. And we decided that we wanted to kind of expand our understanding of who needs care in our community. So it's not just people who are giving birth and their partners, but also we have community members that are queer, trans, they could be single parents. And we wanted to create a space where also they would also be taken into consideration and cared for within the system. So that kind of one policy became the kind of site of experiment and change. And I think over the years, there's been like, okay, we need to change and adapt it. But already there was a lot of this deep organizational reflection of how equity can be applied, not only on a policy level, but also on a relational level. So once you kind of find these places to take action, you can kind of start looking at it, step back and reflect and see how did it go? And then you're going to kind of start weaving this work in over time. And so in the end, it's not only about creating change on an individual level, but it's also working at the structural, cultural, and kind of relational levels. And so you might go through these different steps multiple times in a year. So you could go 3 times in 18 months, but it's really about figuring out what is the rhythm that makes sense for you. Do you want to add anything?
No, I was just going to say, just to put a point on the
Yeah.
question about accountability, because that was
Yeah.
also the number one question in the first word cloud that we did, because an audit really gives some sense of
Mm,
accountability. It's a sort of measurement. I would say ideally in this little loop, this active loop, you've tried to do something. You've improved your event planning. You've improved your little marketing campaign. You've done something. You should be able to have immediate feedback on how that went.
yeah.
It allows you, and you should report on that. You should document that. That is evidence around how you are doing. And if you do this a few times, like Emily said, you'll take it back into your reflection mode and say, okay, now how are we doing? And I did this with an organization recently. They had been doing this work for about 3 years, equity work, and they asked me to do an audit 3 years in. And I was like, you know what? I don't think you need an audit so much as this, like, let's take all that evidence of the stuff that you did and the feedback that you got from it and take it into reflection mode for a bit. Let's pause, take some rest,
Yeah.
and see how it lands again. And I'll say more on this organization later when we get to the paradoxes piece. But I feel like there's a lot of accountability that comes from just doing that. It doesn't need to be comprehensive. It doesn't need to be these sort of like standardized lists of indicators and
Yeah.
measures. In fact, it's almost always relational. That is the ultimate measure of your work. How are your relationships? And you can, that's a felt sense. Everyone will know whether that's working or not working. And another measure, I would say, I would put relationships first. And the second measure is that internal capacity. When
Yeah.
issues of equity arise, can your organization respond to them a little bit faster, a little bit easier, with less conflict, with a little bit more clarity? That's another measure of how well you're doing this work.
Yeah. And just to bounce off that briefly, it's like it's sometimes can be useful to track what are the stories that you're telling about your organization now, and then what are the stories you're telling about your organization 6 months from now, 1 year from now. That can often be a less of a quantitative kind of metric to look at, but it can be very, very evocative. One question I like to ask groups that I work with, what is a metaphor for your organization? And it's very powerful when people are like, feels like a dumpster fire, and that there's a massive storm coming to being like, oh, I see there's like a little bit of light
Right.
coming there. That gives you that felt sense that things are sh shifting as well. All right. Does this make sense? Are there questions?
Yeah. We got a hand up. BC Museums. You can unmute. Go ahead.
Oh, thanks everyone. Um, Yeah, I was kind of curious how you um, first of all, thank you for a wonderful presentation. Kind of going back to where you started at the beginning, that there's like a difference between, say, indigeneity and then equity. I think about for the sector I'm in, which is museums, like there is sometimes a competing um, interest in organizations where um, duty to serve indigenous people or say the cultural belongings uh, might in some ways usurp kind of other equity concerns. And I think often sometimes um, there becomes a um, uh, one equity concern that was identified. Say the one I always hear is like building the wheelchair ramp or something, right? Becomes the focus, but then everything else is pushed to the side. And I'm kind of curious about um, what advice you might have. And I kind of heard it today, but just maybe kind of revisiting that a bit. Like, I think people have sometimes they're in practice mode and they're like, we're doing these equity things, but often at the expense of other groups. And I know we kind of talked about that, but I'm kind of curious how you might revisit that. I heard you sort of say things like it should kind of lift everyone up.
Yeah.
However, I'm not seeing that happen, and I'm kind of curious how you might revisit that, or how if someone has a or an organization has a large commitment to one element of equity, how might they kind of potentially step back to start serving other elements of equity, right? So
Emily, do you wanna take it or?
I feel like I'll answer one part of it and then I'd love to bounce it off of you. So one of the theories that we actually put into the guide is this idea of the cut curb theory. And the ideas, are you familiar with the cut curb theory? I can give a quick summary. So it's these activists in the 1970s in California basically took cement and they basically made cut curves in the sidewalk so that people who use wheelchairs would be able to go over it. And it was kind of the birth of this idea of the cut curb theory. And what they found was that in addition to supporting those who need to use wheelchairs, it also helped people who use strollers, those people who were working and needed to move sort of different items with a trolley or whatever. And so the idea behind that is that it may not be visible, the impact on others, but there can be a way that there are subtle kind of shifts within it. And I think what's coming up for me is that one, is there a way of surfacing the other impacts of this? That might not be your focus too. You might be like, we're good with that. And then two, it's how do you connect with your why again? And I think sometimes if it comes out that the why is actually we are trying to do this on a check mark sort of basis to be done, that might kind of invite a bit more digging and a bit more reflection about like what would actually feel transformative for kind of the system and the space that you're working in. And it can be hard and it can be difficult, but I think that's kind of that dance that you kind of need to do.
Yeah. I think there's like it's you need to take the long view on some of this
Yeah.
stuff and really be relational throughout as things get difficult and there might be perceived feelings of competition
Yeah.
for scarce resources. And I don't want to deny the fact that the work of equity takes resourcing. Like there are small things you can do, I think, without a lot of resources, but I think over time it does require resourcing. And so it does feel like a sort of competition for resourcing. But I think making visible the ways, just reiterating what Emily said, the ways a lot of people benefit from the same change. This can happen a lot in HR. So for example, if you like build in more workplace flexibility, for
Yeah.
example, because of certain concerns that come from people that are caregivers and they need that time and flexibility, but you offer it to everyone, you'll find that everyone, their morale improves. for example, and so that everyone gets the benefit of this change. That's just a small example, but there are lots of things like that that you can do and make those visible to yourself and to others that like everyone's lives are getting better because of this work that we're doing. There is a specific methodology called targeted universalism,
Yeah.
which you could look at that walks you through a way of doing this, like finding the different change opportunities that you have and how they will benefit more than one group at the same time. So there are sort of like methodological ways you can do that. And then finally, I will say we sometimes have to accept, especially with Indigenous folks, that we need to have parallel processes, potentially. It really depends on how they want to approach it with you, potentially parallel, potentially braided, maybe having like an expanded view of equity that's more rooted in an Indigenous paradigm, for example. These are ways in which we can at least understand why we are, again, that why equity, how we're holding these pieces, and we can make them visible to each other as we're doing this work instead of sort of having like an opaqueness around it that's like, well,
Yeah.
we're doing equity, and then it just feels like everyone's competing over this one thing. Whereas if you can start to name how you're managing these different pieces, that can go a long way as well. Yeah.
Great. And just to say, I put a couple links in the chat. I put a link to the Targeted Universalism Institute or whatever it is in
Yeah.
Berkeley. And then I also put a link to a COCO resource about the pregnancy family support leave policy, if that is of interest. I think we might have time for one short
Yeah.
question if anyone
Yeah.
else wants to add anything.
Anything about that circular process, the nested circularity? Okay, we got a hand up. 056. You're on.
My name is Erin from Junior Achievement Canada. Great to be with you all. And I joined a few minutes late, but kind of quickly caught up. Appreciate the conversation. Um, so as we try and think about sort of the proof points that work in equity is making a difference. And so you said, it's about the responsive feedback, it's the relational feedback. One of the factors is as we're making investments, in ED&I, taking more targeted approaches to try and ignite and bring programming to new communities, investing in community mapping so that we deeply understand our footprint, all of these kinds of efforts, even being very selective around some of the vendors and that are doing creative and instructional design work to make sure we're paying for that consultation, SMEs, etc. How we can say that that is the factor that's actually contributing to help to move the needle on either growth or program outcomes, when we're not necessarily looking at demographics as the way to measure equity. So you talked about it being relational and like you'll feel it, you'll get that sense. True, but sometimes we don't know whether or not the sense of that improved outcomes or the relationship is based on other things that are concurrently happening with embracing more EDI&A, like just general innovations and technology and innovations in instructional design versus it's applying the equity lens to that. And clearly we're not in a space where we do like A/B style testing. Here's the version of the program with equity enhancements versus not. That's completely counter, intuitive. But as we try and have the story to demonstrate to leadership, to a board, to an organization that this matters, what are those data points that we would look at? I hear you on the relational piece, but when I've got a very kind of data oriented leadership team or board, how do you express that?
Well, I'll say it will go back to that why equity, and I would encourage organizations to list both principled and practical reasons why this is important to your organization. Principled reasons are like we value diversity, we believe in human rights, like those sort of like value-based things that are just important part of your organization. The practical reasons, and these are where you can start embedding measures that are very specific to your organization. So practical reasons are like we are we are supposed to serve everyone in our community. Everyone's supposed to have equal access to what we do. And we know that we aren't doing that right now. Our mission is to serve everyone. It says, like end poverty for all on our vision statement. And if we're not doing that, like we practically need to improve that. And equity is our way of doing that. And then you can start measuring like who you're actually serving over time as a measure of that indicator. Another practical reason that a lot of organizations try to use is that it seems to be improving decision making, generating more creativity and innovation if that's the type of work that you do. And you can
Yeah.
start to like track that over time. So I would say that why, like the measures that you want to look for are going to they're going to cascade out of your why. And again, those principled and practical, the balance of the two are really important um, to capture. I had one more thought, but Emily, maybe you can pick up while I try to remember it.
Yeah, I'm gonna put a link, and I hope this is the right resource. It's the McConnell Foundation did a primer on developmental evaluation, and so it's an approach that invites more of an iterative approach to tracking the change that happens within the organization, including stories. And so I know there is a bit of a constraint of like, yes, we need the data, and there's also the invitation, like, how do you tell the story of the data in kind of a fleshing out what the data is actually telling you. What are the stories within the organization that you're trying to tell in different ways? And what I have found also in my work is that once you do start implementing these changes, the shifts in numbers and even in terms of representation do change significantly. So, for example, I helped revamp the hiring process of where I used to work, and before we would only get 10 or 11 applications, for example, and majority of them were white candidates. And what we found that after we changed our hiring process, it we ended up getting 70 applications, and we didn't even have to do an employment equity screen because people saw themselves enough within the job postings and in the process to be able to apply. And so that doesn't mean that we're going to be immediately only hiring different demographics. We still had a rigorous hiring process, but the numbers kind of naturally emerge as the work started happening. And the difference is between putting an equity statement at the bottom of your hiring practice to actually changing the way so that people see themselves within the organization, see themselves within the hiring process, and that the experience of being hired felt like one of building relationship before instead of severing relationship. And so what we often heard that even if people didn't get hired, there was a bit of like, oh wow, like I do want to still get it, be still stay in relationship with the organization. So the data points will actually emerge organically as well over time. Did
And
you
I think we
remember?
are, and I think we're, no, I think what I'm trying, we're moving towards the next slide actually, which is sort of like the most uncomfortable part of this process because we're looking for those measures. We want to see progress. We want to sort of feel like we're getting somewhere. And unfortunately, this work presents us with having to build a capacity to sit with paradoxes. Do you want to maybe share where this comes from?
Yes. And just to say, honey, I see that you have an excellent question in the chat, but with keeping an eye on time, but hopefully we'll be able to touch base on that the next time. So this is a quote from the resource. Sustaining authentic equity work demands more than action and policies. It requires the willingness to grapple with inherent organizational tensions. The most powerful approach is often to seize attempts at reconciling opposing truths and simply hold them in coexistence. One of the things that we often find is that there can be a lot of black and white thinking in the work, and that actually was one of the words that came up in the word clouds where we think there must be a right way to do equity work in many ways. And so the invitation is really to be like, actually, sometimes it's a bit more of a dance. How do we hold both of these truths of both having value and insight into what the system actually needs ultimately? Do you want to add anything to
Yeah.
that?
No, but I would just like if we go to the next slide, like
Yeah,
to build off that organization I was telling you about
yeah,
before, they'd been in doing this work for 3 years. Similarly to the what we heard was that they'd made a lot of investments, lots of changes, things had been done. And they wanted to know where they were at, which is kind of why they wanted an audit. But we offered a reflection moment, a moment of reflection to check in with relationships, check in with how people are feeling. And this is kind of what we found, that they were actually at a threshold where they were sitting with these paradoxes. Like, we've done all we can do around EDI. We feel that. And we also feel like we've only just begun. It feels like it should be resolved by now. And also feeling at the very same time that it will never fully be resolved. What we tried didn't work, that feeling of failure. And then that failure is showing us the way. And that this one will happen. In that active mode, you will try things. You will try things and you'll be like, oh, that didn't really quite land the way that we wanted it to. And you're going to go back into your learning loop to figure out how you might take the next step. Audits create psychological safety. This is true if it's done in a way that's not re-traumatizing and not extractive. We have notes on that in the resource as well. But it can also, if you create enough safety, will reopen wounds. And so it may not feel great, but you're actually doing the work of equity in that moment. Um, Everyone needs to stay for change, this idea that like everyone needs to be around. And the fact is that some people need to leave for change to happen. And I think that's okay as long as we can take care of our relationships as people exit an organization and that they can have dignified exits. Um, we seek accountability. That was, again, that huge word that came up in the word cloud. But we also want to resist the urge to punish. This is more on an interpersonal or personal level. Not wanting to punish people, but wanting to also make sure that we're staying firm on our commitments. This process should bring closure, and ultimately, this process will crack something open. There are so many such paradoxes that you will live with as you do this work over the years. Um, Emily, what do you want to say
I
both
think
points, I guess, move into
I
the
think that was beautiful. I'm just keeping an eye on time, so maybe what I would encourage is I'll put two more questions in the chat, and while people take a moment, maybe we can speak to Honey's question. Does that work?
sure.
So we have these two questions. Do any of these paradoxes resonate with you? How did you reconcile, balance them? And how might seeing these kind of polarities as paradox change your approach? So as you're kind of playing with those ideas. Honey wrote, I often hear organizations speak about EDI, and sometimes, I won't say the whole thing. Diversity tells us who is present, inclusion tells us who is heard, but equity asks whether or not people actually receive what they need to thrive. I'm wondering how we can understand where equity truly exists in our world. Do we see a gap between focusing on diversity and achieving equity? Um, I think the first thing that comes to mind, I think we can use whatever word that works for the system that it's in. And so for me, my eyes honestly kind of glaze over when I choose which word I'm using because it's like what fundamentally do we mean by these terms and what are the desired outcomes? Because if you want to have I've seen many like institutional places are like we want equity, diversity and inclusion and for them it just is a pure numbers game. For them, for me that isn't transformative. And so but then I've also seen organizations that talk about representation, but they want to do this deep transformative reflection and learning kind of process. So I'd say for me, it's like focusing on diversity. Let's not even focus on the works. Let's focus on the how, the what, and the kind of embodied relationship that people and the organizations have with these terms. Great. So now we have some responses. Do you want to read
Yeah,
them
thank you.
out?
Thank you for sharing. I have had to learn from making mistakes and use them as an ally to share with other allies to help them be brave enough to keep pushing for change. Thank you for sharing that, Renee. Certainly true. The changes that we feel ourselves are always, uh, we can always share those with others, and they don't have to just stop with us. Innovative mindset and determination to make change. So we move from we tried and it didn't work to failure is showing us the way. You like that one. Awesome. Um, BC Museums, again, I think in some cases, the equity programming in nonprofit centers, European people's experiences of transformation, and that isn't the same as equity,
Hmm.
affinity, material change for other groups, right? Just like really centering the experiences of those people, the for who in that second question, and having that be your guide. Honestly, that's such it's a good, I often call it a bit of a compass when I hold myself accountable in this work. Great. We're at time. And that went by so fast, and there's so much more we want to share with you. But thank you so much for joining us today and for and kind of like entertaining us in entertaining our like conception of equity, moving from audits to a practice. I believe the recording will be shared with you as well as a PDF of the slide deck. But please take a look at the toolkit itself. It has so much more detail on everything that we just shared.